She didn't realize how much scarcity had taken over her life until she noticed how she moved through the grocery store. She wasn't choosing food based on preference or comfort, she was calculating survival. Every item went through the same internal filter: can I afford this now, and will I regret it later? The cart stayed light, not by choice, but by necessity. Standing between the aisles, she already knew what she would not buy before even looking at the prices. Certain shelves became invisible to her, not because she lacked discipline, but because hope felt dangerous. Lingering meant imagining, and imagining meant disappointment. So she moved quickly, focused, emotionally guarded. Scarcity wasn't just in her bank account. It lived in her thoughts, in her expectations, in the quiet rules she had created for herself. She told herself she was being realistic, responsible, prepared for life as it was. What she didn't see was how that realism had slowly turned into a constant state of lack, one that followed her long after she left the store. She believed she was managing her circumstances, but in reality, those circumstances were shaping her inner world. And without realizing it, she was carrying that mindset everywhere, into her home, her decisions, and her sense of what was possible. Her home echoed the same calculations she made at the market. The refrigerator was never completely empty, but it was never abundant either. Everything had a purpose, a limit, an order that reflected how carefully she tried to control what little she had. Food wasn't comfort, it was strategy. She learned to stretch meals without thinking about it. To turn leftovers into something new. To postpone cravings until they stopped appearing. Over time, desire itself became something she questioned, as if wanting more were irresponsible when stability felt so fragile. Money dictated not only what she bought, but how she thought. Every bill arrived with a familiar weight, not because it was unexpected, but because it confirmed what she already believed, that life required constant restraint. She lived one step ahead of shortage, never fully safe, never fully relaxed. The most exhausting part wasn't the lack itself. It was the vigilance. The constant monitoring of numbers, of dates, of choices. Even moments of rest carried an undercurrent of concern, as if peace were something she had to justify. She rarely spoke about it. On the outside, she seemed disciplined, organized, responsible. Inside, she lived with the quiet fear that one small mistake could unravel everything she had worked so hard to hold together. Scarcity became familiar. Predictable. Almost comforting in its consistency. She didn't question it anymore, she adapted to it. And without realizing it, she began shaping her entire identity around the idea that this was simply how life worked for her. Living in constant containment began to affect her in ways she didn't immediately recognize. She noticed it in how tense her body felt even during simple moments, like sitting down to eat or opening the fridge. There was always an invisible calculation running in the background, reminding her not to relax too much, not to assume things would be fine. She realized how rarely she allowed herself to feel safe. Even on days when nothing went wrong, she stayed alert, as if peace were temporary and required constant supervision. Her mind moved ahead of the present moment, scanning the future for potential problems before they had a chance to exist. This way of living slowly shaped her expectations. She stopped imagining abundance not because she didn't want it, but because it felt unrealistic. Wanting more began to feel naive. Stability, even when uncomfortable, felt more reliable than hope. She didn't see this as pessimism. She saw it as maturity. As being grounded in reality. But the truth was more subtle. She had learned to equate safety with limitation, and freedom with risk. That belief quietly influenced every decision she made. Moments of comparison became painful. Watching others shop without hesitation, cook freely, or talk casually about plans made her retreat inward. Not out of jealousy, but out of self-protection. She told herself their lives were different, that those things simply weren't meant for her. What she didn't yet understand was how deeply these thoughts were shaping her reality. Scarcity wasn't just something she experienced, it was something she carried, reinforced daily through repetition and expectation. And as long as that pattern remained unchallenged, her external world had no reason to change. The question didn't arrive as a rebellion. It came quietly, almost accidentally, during an ordinary moment. Standing in her kitchen one evening, looking at what little was left in the refrigerator, she caught herself wondering, not with anger, but with fatigue, if this was really how life was supposed to feel all the time. She noticed how familiar the pattern had become. Wake up, calculate. Work, restrain. Shop, limit. Repeat. There was no space between one concern and the next, no pause where ease could settle. Even when she managed well, the relief never lasted long enough to feel real. That realization unsettled her more than she expected. Not because it offered hope, but because it exposed something she had avoided acknowledging. She wasn't just dealing with temporary lack. She was living inside a mindset that assumed lack was permanent. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider that maybe her circumstances weren't the only thing shaping her experience. Maybe the way she anticipated loss, the way she expected restriction, was quietly influencing what showed up in her life. The idea felt uncomfortable. It challenged the identity she had built around being careful and realistic. If scarcity wasn't inevitable, then it meant she had been participating in it, unknowingly, but consistently. She didn't have answers yet. She wasn't ready to believe anything different. But the question lingered, refusing to disappear. And once it appeared, it subtly shifted how she observed her thoughts, as if a door had cracked open inside her awareness. That small opening didn't change her reality overnight. But it marked the first moment she stopped accepting scarcity as an unquestionable truth, and that alone was enough to begin altering the direction of her story. Her first encounter with the idea didn't come through a dramatic revelation or a deliberate search. It happened during a moment she hadn't planned for. Sitting in a waiting room, half distracted, she noticed a folded paper on the chair beside her. Someone had left it behind. Normally, she would have ignored it. That day, she didn't. The paper contained a simple handwritten quote. Nothing elaborate. Just a few lines about thoughts shaping reality and attention directing outcomes. She read it once, then again, unsure why it felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't motivational in the way she was used to. It felt observational. Almost confrontational. She slipped the paper into her bag without overthinking it. Later that night, when she found it again, she felt a quiet resistance rise inside her. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as unrealistic. Another part couldn't stop replaying the words in her mind. They lingered longer than fear usually did. She began noticing how often her thoughts centered on what she didn't have. How automatically her mind rehearsed shortage before anything even happened. The paper hadn't caused that awareness, it had simply revealed something that was already there. Curiosity followed discomfort. She searched for similar ideas online, cautiously, almost defensively. That's when she first encountered discussions about mindset, attraction, and the relationship between internal focus and external experience. She didn't call it belief. She called it observation. What unsettled her most was how familiar the concept felt. As if it explained something she had been living without language for. She wasn't ready to accept it fully, but she couldn't ignore the possibility that her inner world had been quietly shaping her outer one. That night, lying awake, she realized something important. Even if none of it was true, continuing to live inside constant scarcity clearly wasn't working. And that realization made her open, just enough, to consider a different way of relating to her thoughts. After that night, she couldn't unsee what had been revealed. Her thoughts no longer passed unnoticed. She began catching them mid-sentence, especially the ones rooted in lack. I can't afford this. That's too much. Better not risk it. They appeared so often that she wondered how she had lived with them for so long without questioning their authority. She noticed how these thoughts surfaced before any real problem existed. Before checking her bank account. Before opening the fridge. Before anything actually went wrong. Scarcity had become her default expectation, not a reaction to reality, but a lens through which she interpreted it. What surprised her was how automatic it all felt. These thoughts weren't emotional outbursts, they were habits. Quiet, repetitive, convincing. And because they felt familiar, she had never considered that they could be reshaped. She didn't try to stop them at first. That felt impossible. Instead, she observed them. When fear appeared, she noted it mentally. When limitation showed up, she named it. Simply recognizing the pattern created a small but noticeable distance between her and the thought itself. The idea of writing kept returning to her mind. Not journaling in an emotional way, but something more intentional. A place to slow the thoughts down. To see them clearly instead of letting them loop endlessly in her head. One evening, she pulled out an old notebook she hadn't used in years. It wasn't special. No design. No intention behind it yet. But opening it felt like creating space, a pause where her thoughts could exist without controlling her. She didn't know it then, but that simple decision marked the beginning of a shift. Not because writing would magically change her circumstances, but because for the first time, she was no longer letting scarcity live only in her mind. She was bringing it into awareness, and awareness, she was beginning to understand, had power. She didn't sit down to write with confidence. She sat down with hesitation. The notebook rested open in front of her, and for a long moment she simply stared at the blank page, unsure of what she was supposed to put there. Writing felt exposed, as if putting thoughts on paper would make them more real than she was ready to face. She began by writing exactly what was there. Not affirmations. Not hopes. Just truth. She wrote about the fear she felt at the grocery store, the tightness in her chest when she thought about money, the way her mind immediately calculated loss before possibility. Seeing it written felt uncomfortable, but also strangely grounding. As the pages filled, she noticed how repetitive her thoughts were. The same ideas appeared again and again, slightly rearranged but rooted in the same belief, that there was never enough. That realization alone shifted something. Scarcity wasn't random. It was rehearsed. After a while, she paused. The notebook was no longer just a place for observation. It felt like an invitation. If thoughts could be repeated unconsciously, maybe they could be repeated intentionally too. The idea felt risky, almost irresponsible, but it stayed with her. Carefully, without conviction, she turned the page. Her pen hovered again before touching the paper. This time, she didn't write what she feared. She wrote what felt unfamiliar. I am open to experiencing abundance in simple ways. She read the sentence slowly, waiting for resistance to rise. It did, but not as strongly as she expected. The words didn't feel true yet, but they didn't feel impossible either. They felt like a direction she had never allowed herself to face. That night, she closed the notebook and placed it beside her bed. Nothing had changed externally. The fridge was still mostly empty. The numbers were still the same. But something subtle had shifted. For the first time, she had interrupted the pattern, and that interruption would quietly begin reshaping everything that followed. She didn't sit down to write with confidence. She sat down with hesitation. The notebook rested open in front of her, and for a long moment she simply stared at the blank page, unsure of what she was supposed to put there. Writing felt exposed, as if putting thoughts on paper would make them more real than she was ready to face. She began by writing exactly what was there. Not affirmations. Not hopes. Just truth. She wrote about the fear she felt at the grocery store, the tightness in her chest when she thought about money, the way her mind immediately calculated loss before possibility. Seeing it written felt uncomfortable, but also strangely grounding. As the pages filled, she noticed how repetitive her thoughts were. The same ideas appeared again and again, slightly rearranged but rooted in the same belief, that there was never enough. That realization alone shifted something. Scarcity wasn't random. It was rehearsed. After a while, she paused. The notebook was no longer just a place for observation. It felt like an invitation. If thoughts could be repeated unconsciously, maybe they could be repeated intentionally too. The idea felt risky, almost irresponsible, but it stayed with her. Carefully, without conviction, she turned the page. Her pen hovered again before touching the paper. This time, she didn't write what she feared. She wrote what felt unfamiliar. I am open to experiencing abundance in simple ways. She read the sentence slowly, waiting for resistance to rise. It did, but not as strongly as she expected. The words didn't feel true yet, but they didn't feel impossible either. They felt like a direction she had never allowed herself to face. That night, she closed the notebook and placed it beside her bed. Nothing had changed externally. The fridge was still mostly empty. The numbers were still the same. But something subtle had shifted. For the first time, she had interrupted the pattern, and that interruption would quietly begin reshaping everything that followed. The first external signs didn't look like abundance in the way she had imagined it. They came as moments of ease where tension used to live. A small discount she hadn't expected. An extra item added at checkout without explanation. A bill that turned out to be lower than she had braced herself for. Nothing dramatic, but enough to make her pause. Her initial reaction was suspicion. She caught herself wondering what would compensate for this later, where the balance would be taken from. That reflex surprised her. Even when something went right, her mind immediately searched for the cost. Recognizing that pattern felt like another layer of awareness opening. Instead of dismissing the moments, she wrote them down in the journal manifestation. Not to exaggerate them, but to acknowledge them. One evening she noted, I notice when things support me. Writing it felt simple, but it carried weight. She was training her attention in a new direction. She also noticed how differently she moved through her days. She wasn't rushing decisions as quickly. She wasn't avoiding certain thoughts out of fear. There was a growing sense that she didn't need to protect herself from every possibility anymore. That alone made life feel lighter. The grocery store began to feel different too. The aisles no longer triggered the same urgency. She allowed herself to consider options instead of immediately dismissing them. Sometimes she still chose the cheaper item, but the choice came from calm, not fear. What stood out most was the absence of constant internal noise. Scarcity had once narrated her entire experience. Now, that voice appeared less frequently, and when it did, it no longer sounded absolute. It sounded like a habit slowly losing its grip. She didn't call this manifestation yet. She simply noticed that her relationship with life was shifting, and life, in subtle ways, seemed to be responding. As those small moments accumulated, she began to feel something unfamiliar settling into her daily life, a sense of allowance. She was no longer bracing for loss before it arrived. Instead, she found herself responding to situations as they were, not as she feared they would become. That subtle shift changed how she experienced everything. Money still mattered, of course. The numbers hadn't magically transformed overnight. But the emotional charge around them had softened. Bills no longer felt like threats waiting to strike. They felt like responsibilities she could face without collapsing internally. That distinction made all the difference. She noticed opportunities she would have ignored before. A short-term job offer she once would have dismissed as not worth the effort. A conversation that led to a practical solution instead of another dead end. None of it felt forced. It felt noticed. In the journal manifestation, her writing evolved again. She no longer focused only on thoughts and emotions. She began recording decisions she made differently. One entry read, "I respond instead of reacting." Another followed, "I allow support to show up in practical ways." The words reflected how grounded she felt becoming. Her confidence grew quietly. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that steadies your voice and clears your mind. She trusted herself more. Trusted that even if something unexpected happened, she could adjust without spiraling into fear. She realized that scarcity had once kept her vision narrow. Now, that vision was expanding, not into fantasy, but into possibility. She wasn't imagining a life of excess. She was allowing a life without constant restriction. And as that internal space widened, her external world began offering responses that matched it, calmly, consistently, and without drama. What made her pause wasn't one good day, but several in a row. Moments that once felt rare were beginning to repeat themselves with a consistency she hadn't experienced before. Groceries lasted a little longer. Bills were paid without the familiar knot in her stomach. There was space between one worry and the next. She noticed how different repetition felt when it worked in her favor. Scarcity had once repeated itself relentlessly, reinforcing the same outcomes again and again. Now, ease was doing the same, quietly, without announcing itself, but undeniably present. Her relationship with money continued to soften. She stopped viewing it as something that constantly escaped her grasp and started seeing it as something that flowed in response to her choices. Not perfectly, not abundantly yet, but steadily enough to feel trustworthy. In the journal manifestation, she began writing with more confidence. The words no longer felt like experiments. They felt aligned with what she was living. One evening she wrote, "Stability feels familiar to me now." The sentence surprised her with how natural it felt to put on paper. She realized how much energy she had once spent anticipating loss. That energy was now available for practical thinking, planning, and even rest. She slept better. Ate with more presence. Made decisions without the urgency that had once defined her days. What stood out most was how her body responded. The constant tension she had carried for so long had loosened. She no longer lived in anticipation of the next problem. She lived in response to the present moment, and the present was finally supportive. For the first time, she allowed herself to admit it. This wasn't luck passing through. This was a new pattern forming. And she was actively participating in it. As stability became more familiar, she started noticing something even more subtle. Her thoughts were no longer dominated by preparation for loss. She wasn't constantly rehearsing worst-case scenarios or planning how to survive the next shortage. That mental space, once filled with fear, was slowly becoming available for something else. She realized how much of her energy had been consumed by anticipation. Not action, but anticipation. The constant imagining of what could go wrong had shaped her behavior more than reality itself ever had. Letting go of that habit felt strange at first, almost irresponsible, but also deeply relieving. Her days felt less compressed. Time no longer seemed to rush past her in a blur of concern. She noticed small pleasures again, cooking without calculation, choosing without guilt, resting without mentally punishing herself for it. These moments weren't extravagant, but they felt expansive. When she returned to the journal manifestation, her writing reflected this internal calm. She no longer wrote from urgency. She wrote from presence. One entry stood out clearly on the page. "I am safe to receive more than the bare minimum." The sentence felt grounding, not hopeful, as if it were stating something her body had already begun to accept. She also became more honest with herself about what she wanted. Not in grand terms, but in simple ones. Enough food without stress. Enough money without fear. Enough space to breathe. Wanting those things no longer felt greedy. It felt natural. What surprised her most was how quickly her environment mirrored this shift. Life didn't suddenly overflow, but it stopped resisting her. Solutions appeared where problems once repeated. Support showed up where she had expected limitation. She understood then that she hadn't just changed her circumstances, she had changed her internal baseline. And once that baseline shifted, the idea of returning to constant scarcity no longer made sense. As this new sense of stability settled in, she became aware of another shift happening beneath the surface. She was no longer making decisions from fear, but from discernment. The difference was subtle, yet profound. Fear had once narrowed her options, discernment expanded them without overwhelming her. She noticed how her internal dialogue had changed. Instead of asking, "What if I lose this?" she found herself asking, "What supports me best right now?" That question felt kinder, calmer, and more constructive. It allowed her to respond thoughtfully instead of reacting defensively. Her relationship with money continued to evolve alongside her self-trust. She wasn't reckless or careless, she was intentional. She planned without panic. She spent without guilt. She saved without obsession. That balance felt new, but deeply grounding. In the journal manifestation, her writing reflected this maturity. She no longer wrote to fix something broken. She wrote to stay aligned with what was already working. One evening, she wrote, "I trust myself to make supportive choices." The sentence felt steady, rooted, and true. She realized how much of her previous life had been shaped by avoidance. Avoiding desire. Avoiding hope. Avoiding the possibility of disappointment. Now, she allowed herself to look forward gently, without demanding guarantees from the future. The external world continued to respond in quiet, practical ways. Opportunities appeared through conversations. Resources stretched further than before. Solutions felt accessible instead of distant. None of it felt dramatic, it felt coherent. And in that coherence, she sensed something important. This wasn't a temporary improvement. It was a new way of living, one where stability was not something she chased, but something she sustained through alignment and awareness. With this new sense of steadiness, she began to reflect on how deeply scarcity had once shaped her identity. It hadn't just influenced what she bought or how she spent money, it had defined who she believed she was allowed to be. Careful. Limited. Always one step away from not enough. She noticed how different it felt to wake up without that weight pressing on her chest. Mornings no longer started with immediate concern about what might go wrong. They began with presence. With the quiet understanding that she could face the day without bracing herself for loss. Her confidence wasn't loud or performative. It showed up in subtle ways. In the way she spoke. In how she made eye contact. In how she allowed herself to consider options without immediately dismissing them as unrealistic. That confidence wasn't something she forced, it emerged naturally as fear loosened its grip. The journal manifestation continued to serve as an anchor. Not a place of urgency, but a place of reflection. One evening, she wrote thoughtfully, "I no longer live in anticipation of lack." Reading it back, she realized how far she had come internally. That sentence would have felt impossible just months earlier. She also became more aware of how her energy affected others. Conversations flowed more easily. People responded with openness. Support arrived through unexpected channels, not because she asked for it desperately, but because she was receptive to it. What struck her most was how sustainable this felt. There was no rush, no fear of it disappearing overnight. Stability no longer felt fragile. It felt integrated, something her body, mind, and environment were all aligned with. And in that integration, she understood something essential. This new reality wasn't something she had stumbled into. It was something she had gradually allowed herself to receive, one conscious shift at a time. One evening, as she organized her groceries after returning from the market, the realization arrived without warning. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't counting items with anxiety. She wasn't mentally subtracting what would be missing later. The refrigerator wasn't overflowing, but it was full enough, and for the first time, that felt normal. She paused, hands resting on the counter, and noticed how calm her body felt in that moment. There was no internal alarm, no background noise of concern. Just presence. That calm caught her attention more than the food itself ever could. It felt unfamiliar in the best possible way. She thought back to the version of herself who used to stand in the same kitchen feeling constrained by numbers and limits. That woman felt distant now, not because she had disappeared, but because she no longer defined her. Scarcity was no longer the lens through which she interpreted every situation. The shift hadn't come from one big breakthrough. It had been built slowly, through awareness, through repeated choices, through moments where she chose to respond instead of react. Each small decision had reinforced a new internal message, that she was safe, supported, and capable. In the journal manifestation, her writing reflected this clarity. One night she wrote with certainty rather than hope. I live in a reality that supports me. The words felt grounded, not aspirational. They described what she was already experiencing. She realized then that her life no longer revolved around managing lack. It revolved around maintaining alignment. That distinction changed everything. Stability wasn't something she chased anymore. It was something she embodied. And in that embodiment, she finally allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been living into all along. She wasn't waiting for a new reality to arrive. She was already standing inside it. With this recognition came a quieter, deeper confidence. She no longer checked her life against fear to see if it was still allowed to feel stable. Stability had stopped being something external she monitored and became something internal she trusted. That trust softened her entire way of moving through the world. She noticed how her reactions had changed. When an unexpected expense appeared, it no longer triggered panic. She paused, assessed, and responded calmly. The situation didn't define her emotional state anymore. She defined it. That alone felt like freedom. Scarcity had once taught her to live small, to anticipate disappointment before it arrived. Now, she allowed herself to occupy space, emotionally and mentally. She spoke with more certainty. Made decisions without rehearsing regret in advance. That shift changed how life responded to her. In the journal manifestation, her entries reflected this grounded awareness. She no longer wrote about escaping lack. She wrote about sustaining balance. One entry stood out clearly. I trust my ability to remain supported. The sentence felt steady, like a foundation rather than a wish. She reflected on how different her relationship with desire had become. Wanting no longer felt dangerous. It felt informative. A signal of expansion rather than risk. She allowed herself to imagine more without immediately shutting the thought down. The external world continued to mirror this internal shift. Money flowed in more consistently. Needs were met without constant strain. Opportunities felt accessible instead of distant. None of it felt dramatic, it felt natural. And in that naturalness, she understood something important. This wasn't a temporary phase. It was a new internal baseline, one she had consciously created and could return to again and again, no matter what circumstances arose. Only after living this new stability for a while did she fully understand what had actually changed. It wasn't just her circumstances. It was the emotional state she had been carrying for years without realizing it. Scarcity had once been her default frequency, the lens through which she interpreted everything. And that lens had shaped her reality with quiet consistency. She thought back to the moment she first became aware of her thoughts, the moment she stopped accepting them as unquestionable truth. That awareness hadn't erased fear overnight. But it had interrupted the automatic cycle that kept reinforcing lack. And interruption, she now understood, was powerful. The law of attraction no longer felt abstract or distant. It wasn't something she had learned intellectually. It was something she had lived. Her inner world had shifted first, gently, repeatedly, and the outer world had followed at its own pace. Not instantly, but faithfully. She recognized how often she had unknowingly attracted the very experiences she feared by expecting them so consistently. Expectation had been shaping outcomes long before intention ever entered the picture. Changing that expectation had changed everything. The journal manifestation had played a crucial role in that process. Writing hadn't been about convincing herself of something unrealistic. It had been about choosing where to place her attention day after day. And attention, she now knew, was a form of creation. She no longer questioned whether this process was real. Reality itself had answered that question. Not through miracles or extremes, but through steady, observable change that aligned perfectly with her internal shifts. And with that understanding came empowerment. She hadn't escaped scarcity by chance. She had participated consciously in creating a different reality, one aligned thought, one written intention, one present moment at a time. Only after living this new stability for a while did she fully understand what had actually changed. It wasn't just her circumstances. It was the emotional state she had been carrying for years without realizing it. Scarcity had once been her default frequency, the lens through which she interpreted everything. And that lens had shaped her reality with quiet consistency. She thought back to the moment she first became aware of her thoughts, the moment she stopped accepting them as unquestionable truth. That awareness hadn't erased fear overnight. But it had interrupted the automatic cycle that kept reinforcing lack. And interruption, she now understood, was powerful. The law of attraction no longer felt abstract or distant. It wasn't something she had learned intellectually. It was something she had lived. Her inner world had shifted first, gently, repeatedly, and the outer world had followed at its own pace. Not instantly, but faithfully. She recognized how often she had unknowingly attracted the very experiences she feared by expecting them so consistently. Expectation had been shaping outcomes long before intention ever entered the picture. Changing that expectation had changed everything. The journal manifestation had played a crucial role in that process. Writing hadn't been about convincing herself of something unrealistic. It had been about choosing where to place her attention day after day. And attention, she now knew, was a form of creation. She no longer questioned whether this process was real. Reality itself had answered that question. Not through miracles or extremes, but through steady, observable change that aligned perfectly with her internal shifts. And with that understanding came empowerment. She hadn't escaped scarcity by chance. She had participated consciously in creating a different reality, one aligned thought, one written intention, one present moment at a time. As this understanding settled, she noticed a quiet shift in how she related to uncertainty. Situations that once would have triggered immediate anxiety now felt manageable, even neutral. She didn't rush to control outcomes or predict every possible problem. She trusted her ability to respond when needed, instead of trying to prevent life from happening. She realized how much of her old life had been shaped by control disguised as responsibility. Planning every detail, limiting every desire, bracing for every loss had felt like maturity. Now, she saw it differently. True stability didn't come from controlling everything, it came from trusting herself within whatever arose. Her days felt lighter because she wasn't constantly scanning for danger. She allowed moments to unfold without assigning meaning too quickly. A quiet day didn't mean regression. An unexpected expense didn't mean collapse. Life had space to move again, and she moved with it instead of against it. When she returned to the journal manifestation, her writing reflected this release. One entry captured it simply and clearly. I allow life to support me without fear. The sentence felt embodied, as if her nervous system had already accepted it. She noticed how this trust influenced her relationships as well. She spoke more openly. Asked for help without shame. Received support without immediately questioning its permanence. That openness created connection instead of isolation. The sense of scarcity that once hovered over everything had lost its authority. It still appeared occasionally, but it no longer dictated her behavior. She recognized it as a memory, not a prediction. A habit, not a truth. And in that recognition, she experienced a deeper freedom than abundance alone could offer. She was no longer living in defense against life. She was participating in it, present, grounded, and unafraid of what might come next. Standing there one ordinary evening, she realized how quietly her life had changed. There had been no dramatic moment that announced the end of scarcity, no single event she could point to as the turning point. Instead, the shift had unfolded through awareness, through repetition, through the willingness to relate to life differently. She understood now that scarcity had never been just about money or groceries. It had been about the emotional state she carried, the constant anticipation of not enough. When that state changed, reality began responding in new ways, not through miracles, but through steady alignment. The law of attraction was no longer something she questioned or tried to prove. It was something she had experienced directly. Her inner world had shaped her outer one with quiet precision, reflecting back what she practiced consistently rather than what she wished for occasionally. The journal manifestation remained a part of her life, not as a reminder of struggle, but as a tool of alignment. A place where awareness turned into intention, and intention turned into lived experience. Writing had helped her stay present long enough for change to take root. She no longer feared returning to the life she once lived. That fear had lost its power. She trusted her ability to notice when old patterns tried to return and to choose differently again. That trust felt deeper than certainty ever could. Scarcity was no longer her reality. Not because life had become perfect, but because she had learned how to shift the internal conditions that shaped her experience. And once those conditions changed, a new reality had finally had space to emerge.